Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Lounsbury, and joining me is my colleague Kathleen D'Amico from the Alumni Office at McMaster. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's Wine Education Series Part 1, Wine Tasting Tips with McMaster alumna Tracey Dobbin, a Newfoundlander based in Bordeaux since 2011 and named a Master of Wine in 2020. There are currently 409 Masters of Wine in 30 countries, including 10 based in Canada. Tracey is a wine educator and a consultant buyer in Canada and France. Her company, Autour de Vin, offers a range of wine education, including wine and spirit education trust courses and wine tours throughout Europe. She is the co-owner of Les Trois Cavistes, an importing agency in Canada. Tracey holds an MBA in wine management and marketing from INSEC Bordeaux and a Master of Science from McMaster University and Dalhousie University. She is an avid runner and spends most of her free time chasing after her one-year-old daughter, and her favorite way to enjoy a glass of wine is in the kitchen island with family and friends. During today's session, Tracey will guide us through a tasting of 5 classic grape varieties, and through the tasting, she will demystify the common terms used to describe different wine styles and will help give us helpful tips on how to taste and describe the various components in the glass. She will also give us some basic tips for food and wine pairing. Now, you don't need to have wine to enjoy this session. However, if you would like to taste along, you can use any or all of the following varieties: Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, and Cabernet Sauvignon. And if you want to participate in the food and wine pairing exercise, it would be good to have the following items on hand: salt, a slice of lemon, a piece of hard cheese, a sweet biscuit, and something spicy, such as wasabi paste. So without further delay, joining us from Bordeaux, France, please welcome Tracey Dobbin.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much, Jessica. I'm just going to put on my screen share. There we go. So with no further delay, we'll get right to it. So we're going to do, as Jessica explained, wine tasting tips. And hold on. I just need my computer to there we go, cooperate. So as Jessica explained, I'm joining you here today from Bordeaux, and it's evening here. And today we're going to taste through 5 classic varieties. So for each of the varieties, I have selected a key component that we would find in the glass to highlight so that you can learn some of the terms around each of these key components. And they are terms that we often hear and the most commonly used to describe wines, but very often misunderstood or misused. So in order to highlight some of these key terms, I've selected these 5 varieties. And at the same time, we're going to go through variety by variety. And each time I'm going to give the key aromas, flavors, and then the characteristics in terms of the palate components that you would most commonly find in each of these varieties. So we're going to go through variety by variety, starting with Sauvignon Blanc. Then we're going to do Chardonnay and Riesling. So those are the 3 whites. And then we're going to move into the reds, and we're going to talk about Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon. And why these 5 were selected is because they are among the most widely planted grapes around the world. And so even in the classic regions in Europe where we don't actually see them on the labels, these are the varieties that we're most commonly interacting with or most commonly tasting in our, I was gonna say daily, but in our regular wine tasting experiences and occasions. And then at the very end, we're going to talk just a little bit about food and wine pairing and some of the considerations you may want to, that you should take into some of the factors you should take into consideration when you're pairing food and wine. So just some simple little tips and tricks to help you to better match your food or your dishes with wine. And of course, then we have the questions and answers. Sorry, there we go. So when we're talking about any wine at all, what we most often see on the back label, and we hear and we're reading about different wines, you know, in the newspaper or in magazines, is these aroma categories, aromas and flavors. So it can be often very intimidating for a number of reasons. I think the main reason why it's intimidating is because it's not that we don't perceive these aromas easily, is that we, in our day-to-day experience, when we're talking, you know, when we're experiencing aromas, we have not learned from a young age to actually attribute a flavor or a name to the various aromas and flavors. So we can, some of the most obvious ones like lemon or garlic, or, you know, that's not in a wine aroma, but some of the more obvious, really pungent or intense smells, we have learned the names over time. But for the most part, we can say that's fruity, or that's, you know, that smells perfumey, or that smell, you know, floral, or that smells, you know, like woodsy. But to get to the actual specific terms is much more complicated, and simply because that process of attaching the word to the actual component, is that work has not been done. So that's a lot of what wine tasting is. That's a lot of demystifying. It is actually just working on associating the names of the aromas to the actual, you know, to an actual name. So one of the ways we simplify this is to actually group the aromas instead of looking at it as a big fruit basket. You know, when you're reading the back, and it can be overwhelming with all the different aromas they might describe. What we do is when we even at an expert level, when we're tasting, we think about it as, do I smell fruity aromas? And then with the red fruits, we group it into, do I smell green fruits, or do I smell citrus fruits, or orchard fruits, or tropical fruits? So we try to look at it in clusters or in categories rather than trying to get really specific about it. And that's a big tip to help you in your tasting. So instead of trying to find a really specific aroma, try to just take a step back and go, okay, is it fruity? Yes. What kind of fruits do I smell? Really rich and really intense fruits? Well, it's probably tropical fruits. Or is it more subtle, and it's probably more, you know, citrus smells? So if we kind of think about it in the categories, it simplifies the task. So we look at the aromas, the big broad categories are fruit categories. So for the whites, we have green, citrus, orchard, and tropical. And for the reds, we are in either red fruits. So reds are like cherry, strawberry, raspberry, or we're in black fruits. And black fruits are things like blackberry, blueberry, black cherry, etc. Black plum. So oftentimes, if you just group it like that, then you can think of lots of examples. It gets easier to get more florals. So there's lots of different florals, but generally speaking, white blossom or white flowers for the whites. And then we're talking about violets for the reds. Okay. Spicy aromas, where usually that indicates, for the most part, that indicates there's oak. So when we smell a spicy aroma, and notably the sweet smelling spices, like baking spices, clove, vanilla, cinnamon, that indicates the wine has been aged in oak. Okay. Then we have certain varieties, and we'll see that in the presentation, have this herbaceous note, or, you know, herbaceous, green, grassy, herbal, fresh cut grass, like Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Sauvignon. We'll talk about that a little bit further along in the presentation. And then again, vegetal. So this is the same. I actually really just group those together. I smell something that's a little bit green, that smells fresh, and I go, I have a vegetal or herbaceous smell. And then it's easy to come up with an example. Once I have identified it as being herbaceous, a freshness, then I go, oh, that's vegetal or herbal. And it communicates just perfectly what I'm trying to say. Okay. And then other types of aromas, you can have toast or coffee, sometimes aged wine. Especially with the reds, you get this, what we call undergrowth or sous-bois, so it smells like damp earth. For the whites, when they're aged, we can smell honeyed notes, is the most common. But when, you know, for most of our tasting, this little group is the main aromas we're talking about. So moving along, when we're talking about, that's for the aromas and the flavors. And the flavors and the aromas should be the same thing, okay? So we when we're swirling the glass, and I'll talk about that in a moment, we smell, we think, is it fruity? Is it floral? Those big categories. And then we try to get a little bit more specific. And then when we taste the wine, these are the 5 things that we're looking at. We're looking at the sweetness, and the sweetness, it's really, is there sugar left in the wine? Over 90% of wines are dry. Okay, means there's no sugar left. So people often mistake fruitiness and sweetness. It really is. And a simple little trick to know the difference is, if you're not sure, take a little tip, on your fingertip, touch the wine on the tip of your tongue, and you'll tell right away if it's got actually, because it takes away the fruitiness. You're just feeling the sugar on the tip of your tongue. So is it sweetness? Is how much residual sugar? So if you don't like sweet wines, people often mistake it, as I said, but if you don't like the sugar in wines, that's genuine sweet wines, okay? Acidity is a mouth-watering sensation. I'm going to get more detail about each of these aspects as we go through specific wines. But acidity is the same thing we have, the same sensation. It makes our saliva glands, it activates the saliva glands. So we're talking about a wine being acidic. It's this, some of the other terms that we use are zesty, fresh, crisp, zingy. These are all getting at the same thing. And all you have to think about is, how does my mouth react when I taste a green apple, or when I taste something like a piece of lemon? Okay, that's the same thing. It's the wine that has, in the case of wine, the majority of acidity comes from tartaric acid, but it has the same impact on our mouth as citric acid or malic acid. It's just actually activating our saliva glands. And I'm going to teach you a few little tricks how to quantify that. Then we have body. Body is the one I think is most often confused. So body is talking about the weight or the richness. The better word actually is viscosity. So think about milk. A light-bodied wine would taste like skim milk in terms of the thickness, the weight on your palate. A full-bodied wine would be more like whole milk. So that's it. If you like a light-bodied wine, you like something that's a little lighter on the weight in terms of the richness. It's not referring to anything else. You can have a light-bodied sweet wine. Usually the sugar will add weight, but you can have a lighter-bodied sweet wine, and you can have a very full-bodied sweet wine. You can have tannic wines that are, lighter in body, and you can have a full body. So it's an independent, yes, it's related somehow, but it's, we look at each of these components independently. Then tannins. So tannins are actually suspended particles in the wines, if you will. So they're suspended, and why a wine, when it gets older, it has less tannin, is because over time, these tannins have a electrostatic, charge. So over time, they lose their charge. I just lost my presentation's just changed format. Over time, the tannins lose some of their charge, and they form what we call polymers. They form links with each other, and they get heavier as they get longer chains, and they fall to the bottom. And that's that deposit we'll see on older wines, especially like a port. Okay, tannins, because of that electrostatic charge, they actually bind with the saliva in our mouth. And that's why we get the mouth drying sensation, because we feel, it actually is taking the saliva away from its, it's binding with the saliva. So we have less saliva doing its job of lubricating our palate. So a high tannic wine feels gum drying. Okay. And you'll feel it really right up in your gums, up in here. When you do this and your gums will stick, it's high tannin. Or a medium tannin, you'll grip, run your tongue along the roof of your mouth and it's grippy. That's tannins, okay? We don't have tannins in white, only in red, okay? And then flavors should match the aromas. The difference is that, when you have a cold and you're stuffed up in your nose and you can't really taste very much, but you can taste kind of bitter and sweet and salty. Well, our palate is only capable of actually tasting bitter, salty, sweet, umami, a few different flavors, and very few that are actually linked to wine. So that's why this whole, slurping of wine came from, is that we actually slurp the wine, because when we're chewing food, we're automatically taking air into our, what we call a retronasal passage. It's like breathing backwards or tasting backwards, right? excuse me, smelling backwards. You're sucking air across the wine, and that air will take up the aroma particles and go back up into our retronasal passage, back up. So we're smelling backwards. That's all it is. That's why this slurping happens. People get a little bit exaggerated about it and do a lot of slurping. You only need to slurp once or twice to confirm, am I tasting the same things that I smelled? Sometimes some flavors, especially the deeper tone flavors, will, like in a big red, might warm up on your palate. So with that slurp, they might be more present or more apparent. So it's worth going back and doing a few slurps on a big red. But really, you just confirm and you move on. Okay. Sorry, it's a little bit. There we go. So let's move on to the first element, is acidity. And I talked about it a little bit, but now I'm going to talk about it in a little bit more detail. So it's a mouth-watering sensation. It makes the wine taste refreshing, which is why we give high acid wines the descriptors of zesty, fresh, crisp. These are the most common terms that are associated with high acid wines. White wines have higher levels of acidity, and cool climates have higher acid wines, or higher levels of acidity. Okay, so the cooler the climate, the less ripe the fruit, and therefore the higher the acid. It's really important in balance. So if you have too much acidity in a wine, the wine will taste tart. You'll tell right away, and the wine is out of balance. Oh, and really, tart is the best way to describe it. If you have too little acidity, it'll taste flabby or flat. Okay, and then it's really important for sweet wines because it will give a balance, and which is why often the sweet wines come from really cool climates, like in Canada, because we have so much acidity in our wines and it balances off that sweetness. Now, how do we taste acidity? I'll teach you a few little tips in a second. But first, I'm going to talk about Sauvignon Blanc, because Sauvignon Blanc is a naturally high acid wine that we produce. It performs best, therefore, in cool climates. So the aromas and flavors that most are commonly associated with Sauvignon Blanc are the green fruit, like gooseberry or pear, citrus, like grapefruit or lime, vegetal, like asparagus, green peppers, herbaceous, like cut grass is the most common term, and then tropical fruits like kiwi and passion fruit. Okay, so the cooler the climate, the more towards the green fruit and herbaceous and citrus notes, and the warmer the climate, we get into more in the tropical climate. And we don't grow this in hot climates, but in the moderate climates, we get more into the tropical fruits. But you see here again, I grouped this by the categories. So as long as you can sort of smell and go, wow, that smells fresh, then you call it herbaceous, and then the example comes naturally. It's like, oh, yeah, it's cut grass, or once you learn a basic vocabulary, we really learn to taste by the groupings. So on the palate, Sauvignon Blanc is naturally, and the whites we always group them either in aromatic or non-aromatic. And what that just means is aromatic wines, they burst out of the glass. They're like an outgoing wine, if you will. You put your nose in and you smell all the different fruits quite easily. Whereas a non-aromatic wine, it doesn't mean there's no aromas or there's no fruit. It just means that you have to, oftentimes there's other aromas like the oak smells that are a little bit more prominent or obvious on the first smell. And the fruits are not as easy to define. Okay? It's not a quality factor, it's just a style. So Sauvignon Blanc is naturally, and each variety has its own, levels of aromas naturally. So Sauvignon Blanc is highly aromatic. It's always dry. It's usually unoaked, and for the most part, the aromatic wines are unoaked because we don't want to too much fight with the aromas. If you have a lot of fruit, those aromas, the sweet spices I was telling you about that we find in oak, it doesn't necessarily match. Now, there are exceptions, of course, but for the most part, the aromatic varieties, like Sauvignon Blanc and Riesling, the two we're going to talk about today, they are typically unoaked for that reason. They have a crisp acidity, so high, crisp, same thing, meaning they're ultra refreshing. and they're usually light to medium bodied. Now, the classic examples of Sauvignon Blanc are New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. I think that's the one, especially in Canada, that we see, and not just Canada, all over the world. And then in terms of the French examples, we have Sancerre. So if you like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, give Sancerre a try, or Puy-Fumé. It's the two neighboring regions, okay, in France. And in the French wines, they don't tend to actually put the name of the aroma, variety on the label. So they're labeled by their region, the village that they're from, or the region that they're from, the geographical region. So it does take a little bit of study to know what comes from where. But if you like Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, I would suggest you give Sancerre or Puy-Fumé a try. So I've got a glass of Sauvignon Blanc. For anyone else who has, got wine in front of them today, you can go ahead, take a little smell. And for me, I've chosen a Sancerre. So it's a lot more accessible here in Bordeaux than a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Right off the bat, I get really intense aroma. So I'll just swirl the glass a little bit, put my nose in, and I get that cut grass. I get the herbaceous, herbaceous, vegetal. So cut grass, green pepper. I also get a lot of citrus notes, and then there's no oak. So there you go, a little bit of floral, a little bit of white flower, okay? Now, as I said, we're gonna talk about acidity here. So I'm gonna take a little sip. I've got my spit cup. I'm gonna have a little sip. Every time you take a sip of wine, you don't need very much. You really make sure you wash your mouth. If you're wine tasting, you wash your whole mouth with it like you would a mouthwash, making sure the wine touches all parts of your palate. So I'm going to take a little sip, I'm going to spit, and the first thing I'm going to do, as soon as I've spat the wine, or if you're drinking, as soon as you've swallowed the wine, I'm going to drop my head down, and I'm going to close my mouth, and I'm going to count. In Mississippi's, I do in Mississippi's to keep it standardized. So I'm going to count, and for me, a high acid wine, and this is a way to isolate the acidity. What I'm doing is I'm feeling how quickly the acidity, or the saliva is going to pool in the front of my mouth. And this is at a really high level. All tasters do this. And what it does is it isolates the acidity from all the other components. Otherwise, if you have sweetness, it's really hard to actually know how much acidity is there. If you have a really full body, it can be hard to detect. So this is just isolating the acidity from the other components in the wine. So I'm going to take a little sip. Right away, I didn't even get into one Mississippi, and I've got a mouth full of saliva. And even now you can see it's hard to, it's hard to actually continue to talk without, being a COVID risk. So I would call that a high acid wine. It's crisp, it's refreshing, it's nice and zesty. And these sorts of wines, high acid wines, are usually really nicely enjoyed fresh, really well chilled. Okay, we're going to move along. We're going to come back to acidity when we talk about food pairing, but we're going to move along and we're going to talk about body. Now, I mentioned body earlier, but I'm going to come back to body. And as I said, it's about the weight of the wine on your palate, or the viscosity. So a light bodied wine means it's more like skim milk. When you move, and how do you feel body? Move your tongue through it. You move your tongue through the wine and you feel how rich or how viscous the texture is. And that's it. So you move your tongue through it. And it's not a matter of, people often think, oh, well, light-bodied wines are white wines. And that's actually a myth, because we have full-bodied whites and we have light-bodied reds, as I have in this list. I've just listed a few examples of each. So really, it's an independent component. Now, it is linked to, when you have a lot of tannins, it gives some body, because it's some of the elements, as I said, it's suspended particles. So it's going to add to the body. And higher alcohol wines will have a fuller body, because with the alcohol, you get glycerol. That's why. Okay. But we still look at it completely independently. So for this, to look at body, I'm going to talk about my mouse doesn't want to cooperate. I'm going to talk about Chardonnay. So first I'm going to just introduce a little bit about Chardonnay, and then we're going to taste for body, and I'll give you a few little tips on how you actually taste for body. So Chardonnay is a grape variety, whereas The Sauvignon Blanc performs best in cool climates. Chardonnay is a little, it's non-aromatic, meaning not that it has no fruit smells. It's just that it doesn't have those really exuberant jump out of the glass fruit smells. It's a little bit more muted in its fruits, or a little bit more subtle in its fruits. Okay. But it's a bit of a chameleon grape. It performs really well in all three climates. So that's why you get Chardonnay from cool climates like in Canada, but in the northern parts of France like Chablis. And you also find it in hot climates like in Australia and in California. So in the cooler climates, we're going to get what we call the cool climate fruits, which are like green fruits, so apple, pear, citrus, lemon, and lime. You see, each time I'm using those categories first, and then I give my examples. The warm to hot climate fruits are getting into the richer. So in the hot climates, we would expect things like tropical fruits like pineapple and banana and even mango. And that's the sort of fruits that we expect in like a Napa Valley Chardonnay, for example. And in the moderate climate, we're getting peach and maybe a bit of yellow apple. Okay. Other common flavors are butter and vanilla, but that's from the aging in oak. Because it's non-aromatic, we tend to age it in oak. So then we get all these other aromas that go along with it. So some of the structure and style elements of Chardonnay, first of all, it's always dry. We never have a sweet Chardonnay. There are a range of styles, as I said, particularly because it's grown in all these different climates. So of course we have a range of styles, but also because we can age it in oak or without oak. So it also gives even a larger range. It tends to be fuller bodied, but it's lighter in cooler climates. And it has a rich, creamy texture. So in terms of body, let's come back to my Chardonnay. So I have, to make sure that I taste a nice full-bodied, I have gotten myself here today a California Chardonnay. So I'm going to take a sip, and this time I'm going to move my tongue through it. Exactly as I would expect. It's rich, it's creamy, it's got a nice full-bodied like whole milk. And if you have the wines in front of you today, I would invite you to go to look at the body of the Sauvignon Blanc as well, just to do that exercise with both. It's an interesting exercise, so you can start to look at different bodies and how it feels on your tongue. So now I'm going to move on to sweetness. And sweetness, as I said, is probably the aroma that gets or the component in wine that gets the most misused. The term sweetness is the most often misused because people tend to interchange it with fruitiness, and they are two separate things. For example, Sauvignon Blanc is very fruity, but it's dry, meaning there's no sugar. Riesling, on the other hand, is a grape variety that we not always, but often make sweet examples of Riesling. So most wines are dry. And sweetness is referring to the residual sugar in the wine. And what they mean by residual is what's left, and what's left after the alcoholic fermentation. Because the fermentation, the alcohol in wine, comes from converting the sugars that are in the grape into alcohol, into ethanol. So the yeast convert the sugars in the grapes into ethanol, which is the alcohol that we can consume. Okay, so if not all of the alcohol is converted, and there's various ways we make sweet wine. I'm not going to get into that in this lecture. We simply don't have the time. But there are various ways in which we make sweet wines, but all quality sweet wines is actually just made from having sugar left over from the sugar in the grape. So it just means that not all of the sugar was converted into ethanol. So some of the terms that we use, is off-dry, medium sweet, and sweet. Okay, so off-dry, for example, Pinot Gris from Canada, from Alsace, will often have a little bit of sweetness. Champagne, like brut champagne, has up to 12 grams of sugar per liter. Okay, it may taste dry because there's a lot of acidity, so you don't feel the sweetness, and that's the whole purpose of it. It's to help to balance that acidity. Okay. Then we have medium sweet, such as most Rieslings are medium sweet. Prosecco, as a sparkling wine example, is medium. Most of the examples have a medium sweetness. And then you have the sweet or category, which would be like a Sauterne from Bordeaux, or a port wine, of course, an ice wine from the Niagara region. So these would be sweet. So really, going back, off dry, what I always tell my students is if you taste it and you think it might be sweet, but you're not sure, and you do your little test that I told you. So how do you taste sweetness? You're gonna taste it and you'll feel it's sweet. If you're not sure and you go, is it sweet or not? And you do your little test, or you taste it again. Most people just taste it again, or that's my little trick, is the little on the tongue. And you feel that there actually is sweetness in it. It's off dry. It's like, I'm not sure. Then it's the category it fits in is off dry. If it's definitely sweet, you have no question, like a lot of Rieslings, there are dry Rieslings as well, don't get me wrong. But if it is definitely sweet, but it's not sweet enough to be a dessert wine, you're going, I could enjoy this at various parts of my meal, for example. It's not that really super, sweetness isn't the main feature of this wine. Then we call that medium sweet. For the wines in which sweetness is the main feature, they're really, really sweet. You don't need to have, it's hard to have more than a glass unless you really love sugar. But it's, they're sipping wines at the end with your dessert. Then that's the sweet category. Okay. So the wine that I've selected to talk about sweet wines is Riesling, because this is the grape variety that produces, I would say, some of the very top sweet wines around the world, including Canada. So we have, and it produces off-dry, medium, and sweet examples from Riesling. So the aromas and flavors of Riesling, we have cool climate, which is green fruits like apple, pear, and floral notes like white flowers, as I mentioned. In terms of the whites, it's usually white blossom. Moderate climates, we have a little bit riper. We're getting into that peachy and apricot notes. And then when we have late harvest examples, when they're really, really the fruit is really, really ripe, we get into these tropical notes like mango, apricot, and pineapple. When Rieslings age, they give these really distinctive petrol notes that either people love or they find it unappealing. And we also get honey and dried apricot aromas. So in terms of the style of Riesling, it's again highly aromatic. It's again a range of styles from bone dry to very sweet, really high acidity, which is typical for varieties that are used to make sweet wines. It's never oaked because it's an aromatic variety. Okay, and light to medium body, and the examples come from Canada, Australia, Alsace, Germany. So the one that I chose to taste today is from Germany, from the Mosel Valley, and the reason that I chose to taste this one because it has obvious sweetness. So I'm just going to take a quick little smell, and I don't even need to do my test. I taste right off the bat. There's sweetness in this wine, but it's, right on the nose, it's quite aromatic. And if I were to, I'm really going to taste again all that peachy. There's a lot of peach and green fruit in this wine. I'm going to move along to the reds. So with reds, we're adding the component of tannins. Now, tannins come from the skin. It comes from, if you take any table grape and you peel it, like a black grape, and you peel it and you chew the pulp on its own, you'll get a lot of sweetness and, the juicy from the acidity and the sweetness from the sugar. And then if you eat the skin on its own, you'll get this bitter taste and you'll feel the tannins up in your gums. You feel that gum drying sensation. And you need to chew it well, okay? But why? Because that's where the tannins are situated in the skins. So we ferment, we make white wines, we separate the skins from the pulp before we ferment them. So we don't make white wines. We get rid of the skins before we make the wine. For white wines and for red wines, we ferment them with the skins. So we include the skins in the production to make sure we get the color and the tannins. So tannins is a key component in red wines. It's found in the skins. It's felt on the gums and the tongue. and it's a gum drying sensation. It's a major factor in red wines. It gives complexity, gives structure, okay? Some of the words that are used, and it can help a wine age. And as I said, as they get older, so that's why young red wines that are meant to age will be really, really tannic, because as they age, as I explained earlier, the tannins will soften because they'll form polymers. They'll actually form the links and they'll fall out of the wine. So you'll have actually less tannins with aging in your cellar. So the first red wine we're going to talk about is Pinot Noir. So Pinot Noir, in terms of the aromas and flavors, now reds are either in warm or into hot climates, okay, moderate to warm to hot climates. Whites are typically in cool to moderate, and reds are because the skins are harder to ripen and because you don't want as much acidity in the red wines. So the moderate climate, for Pinot Noir, we're normally getting the red fruits like raspberry, strawberry, cherry, and in the hot climates, we're still in the red fruits, but it's a lot riper versions of that. So it's almost into the jammy flavors, and you have a fuller body. So if it's too hot, it can lose the delicate flavor because Pinot is quite delicate. I think also a flavor I don't have in here is actually, it's usually quite floral as well, so violets. It usually has a lovely floral note. We call it the Pinot perfume. So the style and structure of Pinot Noir, it's typically light in color because it has a thin skin. Because it has a thin skin, it doesn't give a lot of color and it doesn't give a lot of tannins. So there's always exceptions like in anything, but for the most part, lighter colored, paler colored wines are lighter in tannins. And the opposite is true. Deeper colored, more opaque colored wines tend to have higher levels of tannins. So they're typically light in color, soft to light tannins, generally a fresh acidity, light to medium body. It's quite elegant and delicate, and a touch of sweetness to the aromas. Now, that's actually misleading because the wine is dry. It just means it's got it should be actually fruitiness to the aromas, okay, to be more accurate. Now, excuse me, I'm going to actually taste my Pinot Noir. So we're going to have a little look. You can't see because my lighting's not great here, but for those who are joining along with their tasting, take a look and you'll see that you can easily see through and to the bottom of your glass. You can easily see the stem of your glass. So if you can see the stem of your glass, that's paler in color. So the color we go pale, medium, or deep, right? So if you can see easily to the stem of your glass from up top, it's pretty a light colored wine or pale colored wine. And we would assume that it's lighter in tannin. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a taste and show you how you feel for tannins and how you rate them. So I'm going to have a little sip. Now, after I spat out the wine, you'll feel tannins in all reds because they all, ferment it with the skin. So I'm going to have a little bit of tannins. But I'm going to rub my tongue along the roof of my mouth like that, and I'll feel a grippiness. And that's, again, because I have the saliva is binding with the tannin, so it's not performing its, lubricating effect or lubricating job on the roof of my mouth. So if I feel easily a big, a grippiness on the roof of my mouth, it's, normally a medium tannin wine. Once I do this and I feel grippiness up into I don't use my tongue because my tongue is going to be filled with tannins. So once I kind of do this and I feel that this is really sticking, then I know it's high tannins. Now, I don't have that at all. Yes, I feel a grip on the roof of my mouth, but I have nothing up here. It's also tannins give a bit of a bitter flavor. So some people are more sensitive to the bitterness than others. I'm not particularly sensitive. My husband's really sensitive. So I prefer higher tannin wines than he does. So just also something to note that people have a different levels of sensitivity to bitterness, and bitterness is a flavor that we get from higher tannins. Now, Cabernet Sauvignon, in contrast to Pinot Noir, is a smaller little berries, the grapes, and they're really thick-skinned. So the thick skin gives deeper color and higher tannin wines. Now the flavors where Pinot is all about red fruits and sherry, even when it's really ripe, it's just a riper version of the red fruit, almost into the jammy flavors. Whereas Cabernet Sauvignon, even in the moderate climates, is always black fruit. So what kind of black fruit? The most common aroma that we get is black currant. Okay, so black currant, black cherry, and it's a grape variety that often has a herbaceous note. Sauvignon Blanc is one of the parents of Cabernet Sauvignon, which, remember, Sauvignon Blanc is really herbaceous. So we get this herbaceous little bit of like a freshness. If it's excessive, it can smell a lot like green pepper. But in the minimal amounts, I just smell a freshness. It just smells lovely and fresh. Leafy, if you will. And with aging, you get this complex earthy notes because it's one of the grape varieties that actually really ages well. Not all Cabernet Sauvignon is intended for aging, but a high quality Cabernet, when it ages, it's going to give this undergrowth and cedar notes. And it's usually aged in oak. So because of that, we get the sweet spices like vanilla and clove. So I'm going to have a little taste of my Cabernet. So right off the bat, you can't see, but I'm looking down. I can't see my stem. The Cabernet, sorry, I didn't tell you, the Pinot Noir I chose was from New Zealand. And the Cabernet I've chosen, I've just tried to take a little tour around the world and not be in the same place. I'm in France twice, but I'm in Chile. So I have a Cabernet Sauvignon from Chile. On the nose, I can smell that it's really black fruit. I get the herbaceousness right away, a little bit of bell pepper, but it's not unpleasant. It gives a nice freshness to the wine. I like it anyhow. I get the spices. I get a little bit of clove, vanilla, again, just sweet baking spices. So when you smell that, it's not about sweetness. It's just the aroma gives the impression of sweetness. It's a sweet baking spice. Now, it's a young wine, so I'm not getting any of the earthy notes. When I taste it, this time, without any question, look, they're sticking. I know it's not not necessarily what you want to do at the dinner table when you have guests, but if you're looking to feel it on your, in a tasting context, you really feel those gums sticking. And that's because Cabernet right away, it really forms a link with all that saliva, and it really gives this mouth drying sensation. Gum drying or mouth drying sensation because it's high tannins. So because of that, it's often, they can be softened from aging in oak, and that's just because it's aged longer in oak, you lose some of the tannins over time. They form those polymers. And also blending with grape varieties such as Merlot that are less tannic. So that's why we often see blends. One of the reasons we see these blends is because blending Cabernet with Merlot will soften the tannins of Cabernet because Merlot is less tannic, has thinner skins. Okay? So we're moving along just really quickly into the food and wine pairing. I'm aware of the time here, so I'm just going to get really quickly. I've got a plate of food here. With the food and wine pairing, don't be ruled by rules. It's not like tasting orange juice after you brush your teeth. Most wines are relatively good with most foods. So you're not going to make a fatal mistake. And that's, I think, something that people really stress and worry about when they're picking their wines and their foods. Most wines go with most foods. But personal preferences do matter. Now, with acidic flavors, it makes the wine taste less bitter, less acid. So it makes it taste fruitier, sweeter, and richer. So if you want to take this piece of the lemon and then retaste your Sauvignon Blanc, that was the first wine we had. It's amazing how much less acidic the Sauvignon Blanc tastes. Even in my little test, it tastes less acidic, but you have to be careful because, for example, when I taste it with that California Chardonnay, right away, it tastes flat. It tastes really flat. I'm missing that zip, that zest. So just be careful when you have foods like tomato-based foods or with a lemon sauce or vinaigrette, anything that's really high, like moderate acidity, don't worry. But when you're dealing with any foods, any dishes that have a lot of acidity, pair it with a high acid wine. It works really well. Then with spicy foods will make the wine taste more bitter, less fruity, less sweet, and it'll increase the heat. So you'd want to be careful with a high tannic wine that already tastes a little bit bitter, that, you know, that and drying, that's the tannins, the bitter and drying. So it makes it taste more tannic. So don't put a Cabernet Sauvignon with a really spicy dish. It's not the best match, unless you really like that bitterness, especially one that has a lot of alcohol, because you're just going to feel that the heat is going to be accentuated from the dish and the alcohol, which is a mouth-warming sensation alcohol is. So if I am going to taste my wasabi, for example, a little taste with my Cabernet Sauvignon, right away, it's really out of balance. It's really bitter. It's really dried out. I don't have the sweetie. All the fruit that was balancing the tannins are now, I don't taste them. So the best, if I go back and taste it again, and go back to my Riesling, for example. It works really well. Why? High acid, calming. It's calming the heat. And the other thing is the sweet works well. Okay? So pair spicy food with lower alcohol wines because it'll accentuate the alcohol warmness, which is why Riesling works well. And if you're going to do it with a red, do it with a Pinot Noir or something that's low in tannins. And then our final, one of our last slides here is the sweetness or sugar. So sweetness makes a wine seem less drying and bitter, and more drying and bitter and more acidic and less sweet and fruity. So we always say it's best to pair the dish with a wine that's at least as sweet. So for example, most people think chocolate and red wine work really well. They actually don't. I mean, if you don't mind the bitter and dryness and the less sweet, but it's not the most flattering to your wine. So if you take a little bit of chocolate, I added chocolate in my list here today, and take a sip of red wine, particularly the Cabernet Sauvignon. Again, it's just accentuating the tannins, so that bitter drying sensation. Now, if you go back, I have a little sweet tart, and if I take a sip of that, a bite of this, it pairs really beautifully with the Riesling that's medium sweet. It actually makes the Riesling taste less sweet, which is not a bad thing. It almost feels dry, the Riesling. Saltiness, it's like salt in any dish. If you add saltiness, it just accentuates the fruitiness in a dish, in the wine. So it's not a bad thing. It actually helps. There's no negative with salt in a dish. It's not a bad thing, but it will make the wine taste even fruitier. And finally, proteins. And proteins, they bind with tannins because that's what's binding in your saliva. It's the proteins in your saliva. So if you want to soften a high tannic red, this is why you pair tannic red wines with red meat, because it softens the tannins because of the proteins in the meat. So the same thing goes with hard cheeses. So for example, I have a little bit of Comté. So I'm going to eat the Comté and then drink. And let it, chew it so that it actually, you have it in your palate. And then I have a sip of my Cabernet Sauvignon. It really is it's a little bit like the acidity. It's quite remarkable how much it reduces the tannins. So this is, again, why they classically do those pairings. So that completes the actual, the lecture part, and I'm going to open up the floor some questions and answers. And I think we can turn on the mics for.
Yep.
Yeah, great. So if anybody has, I know some people wrote in questions in advance, and I don't know, I haven't seen the stream, but I know there was potentially questions being asked along the way. But if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to try to answer them for you. So Kathleen and Jessica are going to field the questions and ask me the questions as they come in.
So Tracy, one of the questions that came in during your presentation, people are just wondering if you could explain again what happens to the tannins in the maturation process.
Absolutely. So tannins are suspended particles in the wine. So my suspended particles, they're suspended in the wine. Okay, they're actually solids that are suspended in the wine, and they each have an electrostatic charge. So they're, they won't, they're like magnets. They won't actually form a bond when they're young. As they age, they lose some of their electricity, the electrostatic charge, and they start to get closer and closer to each other. And when they do, and they form bonds to each other, they make what we call polymers. They get longer in the chains. So it's just because they lose electricity as they age, like us all. They lose electricity as they age, they form bonds, and they get heavier. And because they're heavier, they fall and make a deposit at the bottom of aged wines. That's what older wines are, because tannins come from the skins, as does color. So they have a very complex relationship, bond, the tannins and the color. But that's why with aged reds, they'll be less intense in their color. So they'll be paler, and there'll be a deposit. So the color and the tannins are sitting on the bottom of your bottle, and you'll have a softer in your tannins, and the longer it's aged, the softer, the more these polymers will form, and a thicker, a larger deposit will form. So each year you're going to have, each, depending on how long the wine can age, but with the passage of time, you'll have less and less tannins.
That's great. Thank you. What would be your best fit with oily fish like salmon or trout?
So oil, like richness and acidity, work really well because it cuts through the fat. Some people like to pair the texture with texture, but I like to contrast it. So if you have anything that's oily, like an oily fish, or any oily dish, or like creamy, like excessively creamy dish, a high acid wine just cuts the grease and cleans your palate out each time. Just almost creates a fresh palate each time. So high acid wines, if you wanted any white wines, dry wines, so like you don't want anything that's too, because oily fish is often really quite flavorful as well. So, Chardonnay can work really well. I particularly like a Pinot Noir because Pinot Noir for red has higher acidity.
Great, thank you. And we've had a request. Can you repeat the stem of the glass from up top trick again?
Yeah. So the color in a wine, the intensity of the color is, we can look at from the glass on the side, but the easiest way to get a sense of how intensely colored the wine is when the wine has a good, a little bit, well, that's about right, a tasting pour. So the tasting pour on a tasting glass comes just when the wine starts to curve back in. And when you look in through the glass, if you can easily see your stem of the glass through the wine, it's pale. If you can't see it at all, it's deep.
That's great, thank you. If you choose a high tannic wine because you like tannic wines, why would you pair them with foods that lessen the tannins?
Well, you don't have to. There's absolutely no need to. I also really like tannins. So I'll drink a Barolo, which is, Nebbiolo, which is a really high tannic wine. And I like to drink that on its own. I don't like to pair it with anything. So that's fine. But if they do, the European regions, the wines were originally, evolved with the cuisine of a region. So if you look and you're wondering, this is always a good food and wine tip as well. If you're not sure what to pair with the wine, look at their region and see what their classic dishes are. And, the region where the grape came from. So like Pinot Noir, it came from Burgundy. What do they do? Coq au vin. It's œuf meurette. If you really want to know, and that was one of the questions, what kind of dishes work well in Pinot? the easiest solution is to look at, and there's always reasons. We can look at the theory to explain why. So, you know, Cabernet Sauvignon, the cradle, what we call it, of Cabernet Sauvignon is Bordeaux. And they have a lot of duck here. Duck is a really, it's a dark meat. So, and a really high protein meat. So again, if you like tannins, you know, by all means, have it on its own. But if you're serving it with a, you know, a high protein dish, the other way around, if you look at it the other way around, a high protein dish works really well with a high tannic red wine.
Excellent. Let's see here. Are there red wines, Pinot Noir, that should be served at less than room temperature?
Well, so first of all, room temperature, just so you know, is not the room temperature that we have today. Room temperature is 18 degrees. And, you know, I know in the room that I'm in right now is, you know, up around 22, maybe even 23. So most wines, it's cellar temperature. You know, it comes from old castles and, you know, and old stone houses. So, you know, in general, the lighter the wine, the more it needs to be chilled. So a lighter Pinot, I like to put it, you know, if I didn't come from a cellar, if it just was on the kitchen counter, put it in the fridge for 30 minutes just to bring down the temperature, because it's going to come up anyhow. And even with a high, like if I have a Cabernet Sauvignon or like a richer wine on the counter, but it's a 20-degree room or higher usually, I'll even put that either outdoors or in my cellar and have it a little, it's better to be a little bit cool, which will close the aromas a little bit at first. Be aware. It'll make it less, you know, intense and less easy to smell or to perceive the aromas, but it'll open up quite quickly. And just, you can enjoy that evolution in the glass. If it's too warm, a wine too warm, what happens is the alcohol is you're getting that the ethanol is more, it's too intense, and you'll smell that on the nose.
That's great, thanks. One of the questions that came in before during registration, as we age, does our experience of wine alter, Tracey?
I would say more than aging. I'm going to answer this in two parts. It's more that the more wine we drink, our preferences change, definitely. So, you know that when, I'm sure you've all seen that, as you know, when you're young and you're first tasting wines, we tend to like things like the blush wines or the sweeter wines and the fruitier wines. And the more we drink wines, we go into drier and leaner styles. And that we see everybody everywhere. The more we're tasting, we tend to, it doesn't mean that everyone ends up with this really lean, really dry wine. Don't get me wrong. But it just means that we generally start with something that's a bit sweet and fruity. No matter where you're from, you start with something sweet and fruity, and the more often you're tasting, the more we move into something that's a little bit drier and leaner, and we can tolerate tannins a little bit better. As you age, it depends. Some people, as they age, their flavor, you know, their sense of smell is not as sharp. So, you know, if that's the case, then more pronounced, more intensely smelling wines might be more enjoyable to someone whose sense of smell is reduced a little bit than the more subtle wines.
It's interesting. So many questions. I think we'll just do a couple more. And I think this is a good one. If someone wanted to learn more about wine, where would you recommend that they start? More tastings? Are there virtual tastings right now?
Well, I think the best way to start is with a course. If you don't have access to a course, and there's a lot even online courses, it's best to be in person, because there's nothing that matches going through and doing guided tastings with a professional. So there's, you know, I think the leading courses are the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, so the WSET, and they're for consumers and trade alike. I offer them in Eastern Canada and in France, but I know in Toronto, the IWEG offers them. So the Wine and Spirit Education Trust are the most reputable and the most global courses. If not, just do, and I know there was a question about how you set up a wine tasting. Mm-hmm. Look a little bit online, pick up a book or two, go into your library, get a basic wine tasting, but there's tons. I'm not going to get into recommendations because there's so many. Pick up a basic book, and when you're doing a tasting, do it by a theme. So pick Pinot Noir and taste 3 Pinot Noirs. Or go, I'm going to look at tannins. I'm going to pick up a Pinot Noir and a Cabernet. And just be, focused in what you're looking at and what you're trying to learn, and don't try to learn too much.
That's good advice. There's a few questions about letting a wine breathe. Can you let us know why or when breathing is advised?
Yeah, so we often talk about decanting, breathing, decanting. So basically, first of all, when you open a wine, just leave the cork out, not doing anything, or really, really little. So if you want to let a wine breathe, you decant it. Now, for young wines that are a little bit too tannic or a little bit too, it's a little bit too young perhaps, what we do is we do what we call vigorous decanting. It's basically you turn the wine upside down and let it go glug, 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 glug. There was even like a apparatus that came out a couple of years ago called more than that, like 15 years now, called the aerator. But basically, just turn the bottle upside down and let the wine go glug, glug, glug into a decanter. And even do this a little bit. So it's just really exaggerating that effect. And it's letting oxygen in that'll help soften the tannins and open up the aromas. That's it. For an aged wine, you want, because it's going to come out a little bit closed. It's been in that bottle for a long time, well, depending how long it's been cellared. So for 2 reasons, we want to separate the wine from that deposit of tannin and the color on the bottom, so we don't have a slurgy wine. And we want to let it just open up a bit. You think of it as like the genie in the bottle. You need it to just get out. And so we do a really gentle decant. It's the opposite. And the traditional way is to use a candle underneath so you can actually see as you're pouring. So you take it from your cellar, you try to disrupt it the least amount possible. And when you're pouring it into your decanter, as soon as you start to see any sediment coming in, you stop. So it's really trying to not disrupt that sediment on the bottom, and you decant it, but you don't want to decant. You decant it so that you open up the aromas, but you don't want to decant it so long that the wine, they're fragile when they're old, that it starts to actually, break down a little bit, so you will. So the older the wine, the less amount of decanting I do in terms of time or drinking.
Okay, I think we'll do one more question. So many of them, I think we could probably even do another session here, Tracey. One of the viewers, I know, right? Lots of conversation.
It's a hobby that gets out of control. Careful.
Absolutely. One of the viewers has a red wine from 2001, and it's almost brown in color. Is this okay, or is that a sign that the wine has gone off?
Totally depends. Depends on a lot of factors. Usually brown it's more than the color, smell it. If it smells, so brown is because it's oxidized. Like when you cut an apple or banana, it becomes brown. It's the oxygen. So wines naturally, gently oxidize as they're aging through the cork, right? And that's positive. A really old wine can have a bit of a slight brown color, but if it's too brown, it's oxidized, but you really confirm it on the nose. Does it smell meaty? Are you getting any fruit smells? Does it smell unpleasant? It's oxidized. At caramel, oxidized often smells a bit like meaty, gamey caramel. If it smells like that, unfortunately, you've missed your window.
Good to know. Well, I'm going to have to wrap it up here, I think. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and watching Tracey today, finding out a little bit more about wine. And of course, thank you, Tracey, for sharing the tips with us. Now we're all going to have, we will have a little bit better wine vocabulary now when we're going out and tasting wines and knowing what to pick. So we really appreciate it. Absolutely. And I'll just remind everyone that you will be getting a survey in your email. So we hope that you will fill it out, which helps us with our future events. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, we also have one coming up on December 10th at 8 p.m. And that one is on wine collection and is with one of our alumni, Kent Law, who is in Hong Kong and works for Sotheby's Wine. So we invite you to register for that. So thank you again, Tracey, and thank you to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Bye now. Thank you.